Hi everyone, welcome back to i-TUTOR IAS Academy Tamil Nadu History NCERT series. And today we are discussing chapter 19, that is Constitutional Development. And time period is 1858 to 1947. Okay. So why this is important? The constitutional development of India is 1858 to 1947, known as Crown Rule period. So after mutiny and all, it was a transition from absolute imperial control in the establishment of a sovereign democratic republic, and this era was marked by several landmark acts passed by the British Parliament to reorganize administration and gradually increase India participation. So that is the importance of this 1858 to 1947 period. And key constitutional landmarks are Government of India Act 1858 is there, and it is known as Act for Good Governance of India. Okay, and Indian Council Act 1861, Indian Council Act 1892 is there, and Indian Council Act 1909, that is Morley Minto reform, and it is separate electorate for Muslims. And Government of India Act 1990, that is Montego Chelmsford reform, and it introduced diarchy at the provincial level, dividing subject into transferred and reserved categories. And Government of India Act 1935, and All India Federation and Provincial Autonomy, and Indian Independence Act 1947. Okay, so that is the Mountbatten Plan, and based on Mountbatten Plan, that is Indian Independence Act 1947. Okay, so these are the important key constitutional landmarks of this time period, that is constitutional development. So further we will discuss here. And the history of constitutional development in India begin from the passing of the Regulating Act in 1773, the Pitt's India Act of 1784, and the successive Charter Act from 1793 to 1853 form part of the constitutional charges under the East India Company's rule. And the revolt of 1857 brought about important changes in the British administration in India. And the rule of East India Company came to an end, and the administration of India came under the direct control of the British Crown. And these changes were announced in the Government of India Act of 1858, and the proclamation of Queen Victoria assured the Indians a benevolent administration. And thereafter, the important development had taken place in constitutional history of India as a result of the Indian national movement. Okay, so first one is Government of India Act 1858. The Government of India Act of 1858 was passed by Parliament of England and received royal assent on 2nd August 1858. And following are the main professional act. Okay, this is important, not only in history but also in your polity and public administration portions also. This is important. And East India Company's rule came to an end, and the Indian administration came under the direct control of the crown. Okay, and in England, the court of directors and board of control were abolished, and in their place came the Secretary of State for India and Indian Council were established. And the Secretary of State would be a member of the British cabinet, and Sir Charles Wood was made the first Secretary of State for India. And India Council, consisting of 15 members, would assist him, and the Governor General of India was also made the Viceroy of India. And the first Viceroy of India was Lord Canning. And all the previous treaties were accepted and honored by this act. Okay, that is the Government of India Act 1858. And next is Queen Victoria's proclamation. On 1st November 1858, the proclamation of Queen Victoria was announced by Lord Canning at Allahabad. This royal proclamation was translated into Indian language and publicly read in many important places. It announced the end of company's rule in India and Queen's assumption of Government of India, and it endorsed the treaty made by the company with the Indian princes and promised to respect their right, dignity, and honor. It assured the Indian people equal and impartial protection of law and freedom of religion and social practices. The proclamation of Queen Victoria gave a practical shape of the Act of 1858. Indian Council Act of 1861. The Indian Council Act of 1861 increased the number of members in the Governor General Executive Council from 4 to 5. And further, the Governor General's Executive Council was enlarged into a Central Legislative Council, and 6 to 12 additional members were to be nominated by the Governor General. Not less than half of these members were to be non officials, and thus a provision was made for the inclusion of Indians in the Legislative Council. And the functions of these members were strictly limited to making legislation, and they were forbidden from the interfering in the matter of the executive council. So they did not possess powers of administration of and finance. And the legislative council were also established in the provinces. The number of additional members in the provinces was fixed between 4 to 8. And so this act was an important constitutional development, and the people of India came to be involved in the law making process. And the mechanism of Indian legislation developed slowly and reinforced further by the Act of 1892 and 1909. So that is the Indian Council Act of 1861. And again, one of the Indian Council Act is 1892. This is on 61, this is on 92. Okay. And the Indian Council Act of 1892 was the first achievement of the International Congress. It had increased the number of additional members in the Central Legislative Council, and they were to be not less than 10 and not more than 60. And it had also increased the proportion of non-officials, 6 officials and 10 non-officials, and the members were allowed to discuss the budget and criticize the financial policy of the government. And in the provinces also, the number of additional members was increased with the additional powers. Okay, so that is the two councils acts, Indian Council Act. Next is Minto Morley reform. That's also Council Act of 1909. Okay, so it's also called Minto Morley, and in the name of Lord Morley, and the Secretary of the State for Indian, and that is Lord Minto. That's why it's called Minto Morley reform. The Governor General of India, that is Minto, Lord Minto is the Governor General of India. Both were responsible for the passing this act, and it was passed to win the support of the moderate in the Congress. And the important provision of this act are the number of additional members of the Central Legislative Council was increased to maximum of 60, and elected members were to be 27, and among the remaining 33 nominated members, not more than 28 were to be officials. And the principle of election to the councils was legally recognized, but communal representation was for the first time introduced in the interest of Muslim, and separate electorate were provided for the Muslim. And the number of members in the provincial legislative council of major provinces was raised to 50, and the councils were given right to discuss and pass resolution on the budget and on all matters of public interest. However, the Governor General had the power to disallow discussion on the budget. An Indian member was appointed for the first time to the Governor General's Executive Council, and Sir S.P. Singha was the first Indian to be appointed thus. And in Bombay and Madras, the number of members of the Executive Council was raised from 2 to 4, and the practice of appointing Indians to this council began. And 2 Indians were also appointed to the Indian Council, that is in England. And the Minto Morley reform never desired to set a parliamentary form of government in India. However, the moderate welcomed the reforms as fairly liberal measure. And principle of separate electorate had ultimately led to the partition of India in 1947. Okay, that is Minto Morley. Next one is Montagu-Chelmsford Reform 1990. So the political development in India during the First World War, such as Home Rule movement, led to the August Declaration. On 20th August 1917, Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, made a momentous declaration in the House of Commons. His declaration assured the introduction of responsible government in India in different stages. As first measure, the Government of India Act 1919 was passed by the Parliament of England. This act is popularly known as Montagu-Chelmsford Reform. And at that time, the Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. So that is Chelmsford, Montagu Chelmsford Reform. And the main features of this act were diarchy was introduced in the provinces, and the provincial subjects were divided into reserved subjects such as police, jail, land revenue, irrigation, and forest, and transferred subjects such as education, local self government, public health, sanitation, agriculture, and industries. And the reserved subject were to be administered by the governor and his executive council, and the transferred subject by the governor and his ministers. And next one is a bicameral, that is two chamber legislation was set up at the center, and it consisted of the council of states and the legislative assembly, and the total member in the legislative assembly was to be maximum of 145, out of which 105 were to be elected and the remaining nominated. And the Indian council, in the council of the state, there would be a maximum of 60 members, out of which 34 were elected and the remaining nominated. Okay. And next is the salaries of the secretary of state for India. His assistant were to be paid out of British revenue. So far they were paid out of the Indian revenue. And a high commissioner for India at London was appointed. The most important defect in this act was the division of power under the system of hierarchy in the provinces. So that is the uh, most important defect. Okay, so that is Montagu Chelmsford reform. And next is the Government of India Act of 1935. Okay, so Government of India Act of 1935 was passed on the basis of the report of the Simon Commission, and the outcome of the roundtable conference and the white paper issued by the Government of India 1933. This act contained many important changes over the previous act of 1990. And the following were the salient features of this act. One is provision for the establishment of an All India Federation at the center, consisting of the provinces of British India and the princely state. It did not come into existence since the princely state refused to give their consent for the union. And next is the division of power in three lists, that is federal, provincial, and concurrent. An introduction of hierarchy at the center, and Governor General and his councillors administered the reserved subject. The Council of Ministers were responsible for the transferred subject. So hierarchy introduced, and abolition of hierarchy and the introduction of provincial autonomy in the provinces. The governor was made the head of the provincial executive, but he was expected to run the administration on the advice of the Council of Ministers. Thus, the provincial government was entrusted to the elected ministers. They were responsible to the popularly elected legislative assemblies. And the next is provincial legislatures of Bengal, Madras, Bombay, and United Provinces, Bihar, Assam were made bicameral. And the extension of the principle of separate electorate to Sikh, Europeans, Indian Christians, and Anglo Indians, and the establishment of a federal court at Delhi with the Chief Justice and 6 judges. Okay, so these are the salient features of 1935 Government of India Act. And the working of the provincial autonomy was not successful. The governors were not bound to accept the advice of the ministers. In reality, the real power of the provincial government was with the governor. And but despite this drawback in the scheme, the Congress decided to take a part in the election to the provincial legislatures with the consideration that it was improved of the previous acts. And in accordance with the previous of the Government of India Act 1935, election to the provincial legislature were held in February 1937, and the Congress had virtually swept the poll. And on 7th July 1937, after the Viceroy Lord Linlithgow assured the Congress of his cooperation, and the party formed its ministers in 7 provinces. Okay, so that's all about 1935 Government of India Act. Okay, so here is one chart. It is constitutional development, how it happened. So 1750 to 1800, there is the Regulating Act, Pitt's India Act is there, and the Charter Act is there. And 1813, there is Charter Act again, and again one more Charter Act in 1833. And 1853 the Charter Act is there, and 58 Government of India Act. Okay, so Government of India Act started from 1858. Then Indian Council Act 1861. 92 there is one more Indian Council Act. And 1909, the Indian Council Act, that is Minto Morley reform. Then the Government of India Act, Chelmsford, Chelmsford reform, that is on Montague Chelmsford reform on 1919. Okay, so that is on 1919. And 1935 there is Government of India Act again. So this is the constitutional development and the history of India. And the one of the last one is Indian Independence Act is 1947 also there. Okay, so this is all about this unit and the constitutional development of India from 1858 to 1947. So in this chart there is 1750, from 1750 to 1950. Okay, so 1935 the Government of India Act. Then after that 1947 there is an independence, right? Okay, so in between any doubts you can contact us anytime, and or you can comment it on our comment box also. So today we end here. For more content, do like, share and subscribe our channel. Thank you so much.